All right. After Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, the next series of battles in World War II out in the Pacific begin with Midway and go really through a series of battles that become known as the Island Hopping Campaign, where we basically don't go ahead and decide we're not going to attack every single island, but we're going to just hop from island to island and skip some that weren't really strategically important. And so we're going to talk a little bit about those. Midway is really the turning point in the war in the Pacific, and it occurs early on. Um, in the very opening stages with the Philippines, the invasion there, and and then the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States was kind of reeling a little bit, but we get our footing pretty quickly, and we really start to turn the tides at the Battle of Midway. Midway is an island. It's the westernmost island in the Hawaiian chain. It's actually just a small atoll. It's very, very small. In fact, it's just barely big enough to fit an airstrip on, which is why it's significant. From that airstrip, you could command pretty much the entire Central Pacific. And it's also halfway to the U.S. mainland, so it's a nice stopping off point if you're going ahead and crossing the Pacific. And these are the reasons why the Japanese wanted it. To give you some perspective of the size of the island, literally, if you go stand in the middle of the atoll and you turn around 360 degrees, you will have seen the entire island. It's that small. And so we have this huge battle over this tiny little island. The Japanese invasion force comes to Midway, and we know they're coming to Midway because we'd actually cracked the Japanese military code by this point, and we knew that they were talking about invasion. We just didn't know what island it was, and they had a code name. I believe it was something like Turtle or something like that, and we didn't know what island they were talking about, and so we were trying to send out these low-level communications to get them to talk about this island, and something that wouldn't be that we knew they would listen to that didn't sound suspicious. And so we sent out a message saying, Midway low on water, please resupply. And we sent this on a frequency we knew they were listening to, but they didn't know that we knew they were listening to. And sure enough, over their coded military frequency, it comes back, hey, Turtle, low on water. We knew it. Okay, so the invasion was planned for Midway. So we had actually just fought the Battle of the Coral Sea, which was the first ever naval battle where the two opposing forces never saw one another. It was completely carrier-based. And we lost the Lexington there, and the Yorktown barely made it back. It came into harbor with a list. Its deck was bombed out. It was all blackened and charred. It was in brutal shape, barely made it back in. And as the story goes, it sails into Pearl Harbor, and Nimitz meets the captain there. He knows that the Battle of Midway is coming, and we need every carrier we can get. And he asks the captain, how long is it going to take to get her back ready to go? And the captain says, well, it would take at least 6 weeks. And Nimitz famously tells me, he goes, you got 2. And so literally we put a new flight deck on the as hurriedly as we could on the Yorktown and sent her right back out. And so there's 3 carriers facing off against the Japanese 4. And we're desperately looking for them, and they're desperately looking for us. And really we win just as much because of blind luck as anything else. The Japanese are looking around for our carriers. We're looking for them. And we end up spotting theirs first. It's a PBY, a seaplane spots the Japanese fleet, radios to the American carriers. We launch all of our airplanes to go intercept. Unfortunately, in the meantime, the PBY loses sight, and the Japanese carriers take a 90-degree turn. And so our planes show up, and they're not where we expected them to be. And it looks like we're going to lose our opportunity. And we probably would have, except that there was one torpedo squadron that, almost on a whim, decides to go in a different direction. The commander of the squadron believed that if he were the Japanese, he wouldn't be sailing in a straight line. He believed he'd be going in a different direction, given the way the wind was blowing and everything else. And he takes his squadron off, and he just, by dumb luck, comes across the squadron and radios back to the rest of the airplanes, here's where they're at. And so they go ahead and they come to him, and he doesn't have time to wait for him. His torpedo planes are running out of fuel, and so he commences an attack all on his own, him and the few planes he had with him, and they get wiped out. But the important thing was they radioed back, and we knew where they were at now. And so the rest of the American planes are on the way. And just by dumb luck, the first Japanese wave had already attacked Pearl Harbor, or had attacked Midway, and they were coming back, and they were in the process of reloading with bombs and refueling when those first torpedo planes made their attack. And the Japanese admiral in charge realized, oh shoot, the Americans have now found us. I need to rearm my airplanes with torpedoes to go find the American fleet and to prepare to defend the ships. And so he goes ahead and starts taking all the bombs off that had been intended for Midway, and starts putting torpedoes on and trying desperately to get his airplanes off his deck. and we catch him right at that point. The rest of the American forces show up, and all of the Japanese airplanes are up on the carrier decks. All the torpedoes are up on the carrier decks. All the bombs are up on the carrier decks. All the fuel is up on the carrier decks, as opposed to down below where it's protected. And so sure enough, when the American bombs fall on the aircraft carriers, they're in their most vulnerable position. There's no planes that they can get up in the air to defend them. And the carriers go down. The Japanese will lose 4 aircraft carriers, 1 cruiser, and 253 airplanes. These were the same carriers that carried out the attack on Pearl Harbor. These were some of the Japanese most experienced sailors. They were a lot of their most experienced pilots. Pilots take years to train. So this is a devastating loss for the Japanese, one from which they will not recover. This is literally half their carrier battle force. They had 8 aircraft carriers. We sank half of them at Midway. They will not recover from this loss. We also have some losses. We lose 1 carrier. They do actually launch a counterstrike, and they do find us. It's actually kind of, again, dumb luck that they didn't find us earlier. All their scout planes had reported back except for one. That one had had a radio malfunction. That was the one that had found us, and so we got lucky. So we lose 1 carrier. The Yorktown survived the Battle of the Coral Sea, but doesn't make it out of Midway. We lose 1 destroyer and 150 airplanes. It is the turning point in the war, and it proves once and for all the supremacy of air power. That airplanes and aircraft carriers are the way to go. So from there we go ahead and we start hopping islands. And the first island we attack that's a strategic island is Guadalcanal. It's in the South Pacific. The reason we pick out the ones that are strategic have one of 2 things. Either they're big enough for a runway so they can launch airplanes, or they have a port. Guadalcanal had a runway. And initially, we pick a great guy to go ahead and lead the attack. It's an old, salty Marine general by the name of Fred Vandergriff. And he is rough, he is gruff, he's a fighter, he likes to mix it up. He was one of the few veterans with combat experience from World War I we still had left. And so, I mean, great choice. He was willing to get in there and mix it up with the Japanese and fight it out with them. The guy we initially put in charge of our Navy is a guy by the name of Gormley. Good guy, very efficient, but not a great battlefield commander. And what ends up happening is he lands Gormley on the beach, and he hears that there's some Japanese destroyers in the area, and he pulls his fleet out to deeper waters, leaving Vandergriff without ammunition, which is a lousy place to be when there's a bunch of Japanese on the island. Vandergriff is furious, and it ends up getting Gormley removed from command. He goes back to Washington and serves great in the Pentagon. He's good at driving a desk and a very efficient guy. But the guy they put in charge then after him was another great choice, and that is Bull Halsey. Admiral Halsey, aggressive. He played fullback for the Naval Academy, and he kind of ran a Navy the same way he played fullback. He was just going to run you over. He was itching for a fight. He issues 3 standing orders, by today's standard, incredibly politically incorrect, but very effective for the time. He says, first standing order number 1, kill Japs. Standing order number 2, when you're done with that, kill more Japs. Standing at order number 3, kill more Japs. Again, not politically correct, but the idea was he was going to go ahead and be aggressive. He was going to go after the Japanese anywhere they found them, and morale went through the roof. We were itching for a fight, and Halsey was going to go get one. So from Guadalcanal, we end up winning that battle. Then we go to Guam. Then we go to the Marianas and winning those battles. And then by October of 1944, we actually make it back to the Philippines. 738 American ships, 174,000 American soldiers, and we land at a place called Leyte Gulf. And this will be the decisive battle that really puts an end to the Japanese Navy. The Japanese losses are enormous. They will lose 3 battleships, 4 carriers, which is the rest of their carriers. They will have no more aircraft carriers from this point. They will lose 13 cruisers and 400 airplanes. This is one of the more notable places where kamikazes are used. That, along with the Marianas, is where they actually first appear. The word kamikaze it literally means divine wind, and it traces its roots back to a story where the Japanese mainland had never been invaded. The closest it had come was the Mongolians that showed up. They had their fleet anchored off the coast of Japan, and the Japanese saw them there, and they were preparing to defend the island, but a big storm, a typhoon, blows in. The Japanese hunker down, and when they come out after the storm is over, the fleet is literally blown away, never to return. And so that's what the kamikaze were supposed to be. These pilots were supposed to turn back the American fleet to save the Japanese homeland. It doesn't work out as well for them the second time. MacArthur then finally makes his famous return. He had promised to return when he was forced to leave. Now he comes back. He has returned. The guy in charge of this whole operation, though, wasn't MacArthur. It was an admiral, a guy from Texas, Chester Nimitz. Chester Nimitz is MacArthur's boss, which kind of chafes on MacArthur a little bit. He doesn't like that. But because it's mostly a naval thing, we put an admiral in charge. He's in charge of everything in the Pacific. From the Philippines, we go ahead and hop then to Iwo Jima, March of 1945. The battle is absolutely brutal. Some of the heaviest fighting of the entire war anywhere. And we basically have to kill almost every Japanese inhabitant of that small little island, every Japanese soldier that was there. It was absolutely brutal fighting. And then we go from Iwo Jima to Okinawa in June of 1945. So we're just a couple months out from dropping the atomic bomb now. And again, the opposition is fanatical. They fight down to the last soldier. We take very few prisoners. And Okinawa was unusual because it was a big enough island that the Japanese officers had actually brought their families. And one of the things that really struck the Americans was not only did the Japanese soldiers not surrender, neither did the Japanese civilians. There were stories where, as we started to enter the base, where we saw the Japanese women leading their families to the cliffside. The base overlooked the sea over a several hundred-foot cliff. And these women, just almost unbelievably to the Americans, would throw their children over, killing them, and then jump after them, rather than be taken captive by the Americans. That's how much different they were and how fanatical they seemed to us. It was a crazy. To them, it made perfect sense, but to us, it was unfathomable. We just couldn't believe this was happening, and we were scared. We were like, okay, if Okinawa is really not even technically part of Japan, how are they going to behave? What are they going to do when we actually try to invade Japan? And it really did scare us quite a bit, and it's one of the things that leads us into our decision to eventually drop the atomic bomb. But we'll talk more about that in a